I think it flipped before the start of the series, Jim. Like, I have been driving the Lakers to the finals bandwagon for the better part of a month now. I think I wrote a column on it in mid to late March, and I stand by that. I think the Lakers are the best team in the Western Conference right now because I believe in LeBron James and Anthony Davis as a 1-2 combination. And I don't think Austin Reeves and his play is an aberration. I do think Rui Hashimura, if you're going to leave him wide open for catch and shoot threes, is going to make them. I do think D'Angelo Russell is a capable playmaker. Malik Beasley is a capable three-point shooter. I just think they're really good.
Reeves and Rui were good. Got that part right. Chris Mannix, SI.com, joining us today here on the Kreckman and Lindahl Show on Altitude Sports Radio 92.5. Chris, welcome to the show. How you doing, man?
All right, I can't be made to eat a Lakers cake. That was pretty damn good, guys. Like, in mid-March, I write the Lakers are going to the finals, and I got crushed back then. Yeah, the Nuggets smoked them in 4 games, but point out anybody in mid to late March that had the Lakers doing what they did in the playoffs.
Well, by finals, you meant Western Conference, right?
No. Look, I underestimated the Nuggets in that series, no question. I thought Davis would be better than Jokic. I thought LeBron would not fade as much as he did in the second halves of these games. Absolutely underestimated how good the Nuggets were in that matchup with the Lakers.
Listen, Chris, we played a bunch of receipts back the other day. Yours didn't even make the cuts. If that makes you feel any better, we had Kendrick Perkins. We had plenty. Look, Nick Wright could fuel a whole show in this town of stuff that we'd like him to take back. So don't sweat it.
It is what it is. If you are going to put yourself out there, sometimes you're going to get absolutely smoked. And look, if that's the worst I can be held to, I'll take the Lakers turning out to being what they were any day of the week.
And what's funny, Chris, is we were just kind of doing that to poke at you a little bit. That isn't even so much what we're interested in talking to you about right now. Chris Mannix of SI.com. And look, I'll preface this with saying, Chris, I've been reading you forever, listening to you forever. To be an NBA fan is to consume your work, and I have great respect for you. But you said something today on the Rich Eisen show where you said, of the Denver Nuggets, they're not a compelling team to talk about, to write about, at least as compelling as some other teams. You specifically, said the Lakers, the Suns, Golden State, the Clippers. Why is that the case? If the Nuggets are not compelling, then what is compelling to you?
All right, just some context first. I did the Rich Eisen show yesterday, or was it Wednesday? I'm out in L.A. I'm doing a boxing show on Saturday. So I went to sleep, and I wake up, and, of course, it got clipped, and it was everywhere, and I'm getting trashed by the entire state of Colorado, which is completely fine. I actually I like the passion from a fan base. That's cool. I'm good with that. So to answer your question about why they're not as compelling, it's almost a case of they're just too good for their own good, if that makes any sense. They have been – and part of the reason they're successful is that they have been one of the most stable teams over the last couple of years. Certainly one of the most stable teams this season. Murray was a story coming back early. He turned out to be just fine coming off the ACL. Michael Porter Jr., of course, played great. Jokic, MVP caliber guy. But when you're thinking about what you're going to write about, say from like January on, like the continued success of the Nuggets is not really front burner. It's not really top of mind. What is top of mind, at least for me, is all the instability and the changes that take place in Los Angeles. A trade deadline deal that is the most seismic deal we've ever seen in NBA history, which is the Kevin Durant trade to Phoenix. The Clippers, this load management stuff, is it going to work? Is Kawhi going to be healthy? The Knicks, do they have enough this year? The Celtics, Joe Mazzulla, can he be the right guy to coach this team in the playoffs? These topics were much more, to me anyway, compelling front-burner topics than writing about, the Nuggets winning 4 out of 5 or the Nuggets continuing to maintain their hold on the top of the Western Conference standings. That's not to say that we at SI ignore the Nuggets. The SI's NBA coverage is not just me. I saw my colleague, Rohan Nadkarni, tweet out all the Nuggets stories he wrote this year. He wrote a Nikola Jokic story. I think that was last year. And then this year it's Aaron Gordon, what he's been doing, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, what he's been doing. I think there are one or two others. So there has been coverage of the Denver Nuggets. It's just that for me, from January on, when everything was kind of going crazy in the NBA, parity was changing the debate in the NBA. I found that stuff more interesting. So that's why I believe that the Nuggets have been overlooked, because they're just not as interesting as some of these other teams have been.
So as a basketball writer, the story of a franchise that is healthy, that has stayed the course rather than jumping into the nonstop churn of the coaching carousel, that has not skipped steps, that has made savvy trades and signings without the gravitational pull of, big market attractions that so many other NBA players go for. That is not a cool story.
I think it's a good story. I think my colleague wrote a little bit about it. And to make this point clear, I'm not just writing Lakers and Celtics and Suns every other day. I went back and looked at the last 3 magazine features that I did. One was the story of the challenge coaches, the behind-the-bench assistants that are responsible for signaling whether to challenge, not just the pressures that they feel on a minute-by-minute basis. The next one, I went to Cleveland and spent a week with Donovan Mitchell. The next one, I went to Oklahoma City and spent a week with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. So, we're not just Lakers, Celtics, Knicks, Suns centric. It's just that for the purposes of kind of day-to-day web coverage, it always seemed like there was something new happening with one of those 4 teams. And for me, I thought that was more worthy of day-to-day coverage.
So, Chris, I'm curious about this, and I'll try to give you the genesis of the question, okay, where this comes from. I did a radio show years ago with Ed McCaffrey, right at the time as Christian McCaffrey was up for the Heisman. When Ed got to the Heisman Trophy presentation and ultimately Christian lost it to Derrick Henry, Ed decided to go ask some of the voters, how much of my son did you actually see? To which, from a lot of the Eastern-based guys, they flat out told him, he plays too late. I haven't seen much of him at all. It feels to us in Denver, with East Coast-based guys, and I understand you're based in Boston, how much, and I'm going to ask you just a broader question, maybe not just you in general, but how much do you think the East Coast does take in of this team? Because where we get, again, where I start to take issue with the boring, even though I understand you're talking about not putting themselves out there and not giving you the juicy morsel to chew on or whatever. When you watch the team actually play on the court, to me, 5 guys touching the ball in a possession, ending with an open corner 3 is not boring. It's beautiful. And yet we keep hearing this narrative. Do the East Coast folks really take in this team?
Well, yeah, because East Coast folks, and I'm primarily in Boston, but we also watch the Lakers. We also watch the Warriors. I mean, they're in a different time zone. So we're all staying up late to watch those games. And look, I can't count the number of Nuggets games that I watched. I certainly watched a lot more in the final month and a half of the season as I was trying to discern where my MVP vote was going to go this year. It's great basketball. You're not. I don't disagree with anything that you're saying about the Nuggets. It's just that when you wake up on, say, a Tuesday morning and the Lakers have traded for Rui Hachimura, or Anthony Davis has a foot injury, or Golden State is dealing with some level of dysfunction, there's only so much you can do. Every single week. You're trying to write 2 or 3 times a week. You're podcasting once or twice a week, doing some video. And in part because the NBA has created this unprecedented level of parity, and in part because this play-in tournament has created an unprecedented level of interest in what's going on in the bottom half of the playoff bracket. I think the Nuggets have been kind of nudged out of the conversation. And I think they have a legitimate beef with that. Like this whole Rich Eisen conversation, it began with Rich saying Michael Malone doesn't believe the Nuggets are given enough respect. I completely disagree with that because Jokic is a 2-time MVP, and Malone has been at or near the top of my Coach of the Year ballot really every year since like 2019 or close to it. They don't get the coverage, and that's because even though they're playing great basketball and everything looks great out there, and there are plenty of great storylines, don't get me wrong, it's just not not as compelling in the moment as what you're seeing in LA, Golden State, Phoenix, and other places.
Is it also fair to just say then, from what you've told us so far, and look, Chris, I know, I mean, again, I've had buddies that worked at ESPN Radio. I know the markets they focus on to get attention, whether it's during the radio program or, let's be honest, clicks online. Is it just that, is Denver just not interesting enough to draw enough clicks that they're not worth some of the space on the website at times?
I mean, if something happened where, if there was like a moment where something happened in a Nuggets game, whether it's a negative one with an injury or a great one with, Porter Jr. going off for 50-plus points in like 3 straight games. I'm just making this stuff up at this point. But
Sure.
if it's something, some kind of signature moment, it absolutely is worth writing about. I just don't know that Denver in the second half of the season had too many of them. They were just really, really good. And Jokic was playing really, really well. And Jamal Murray was doing great things coming off that injury. But across the NBA, on a weekly basis, sometimes a nightly basis, there were some really compelling things happening. Kevin Durant gets hurt. You're watching to see how the Suns come together. You're watching to see how the Lakers come together. I mean, it's just – I think web traffic obviously enters into your mind to some degree because you're trying to find something interesting to write about. But at the same time, if something really compelling had been going on in Denver outside of just great success, I'm sure it would have been written about.
Jamal Murray, you said not especially interesting when you were on the Rich Eisen show.
Yeah, I want to say this. I kind of framed that a little bit wrong. The back end of it, I said what I meant, which is not especially interesting in comparison to the other things. That's really what I meant. Obviously, Jamal Murray is incredibly interesting for what he's done and overcoming what he has. Obviously, Porter Jr. is incredibly interesting from everything that's happened to him.
3 back surgeries.
Pick in the draft. I mean, it's incredible. It's incredible what he's done. I was sort of articulating why the Nuggets weren't covered or haven't been covered as exhaustively. And I goes back to the same point. I do think there were, front burner, hot button things happening in other cities that, gobbled up the web pages and gobbled up the airtime and the podcast time and nationally the radio time. That was more what I was trying to get across.
Chris, you know your stuff, and I don't need to educate you on Jamal and MPJ. I want to get to Jokic in particular because you brought him up while you were talking to Rich, and you talked about the lack of one-on-one interviews that he does outside of the NBA mandated stuff, which is a thing that we have spoken about quite a bit. He'll talk to a few local media outlets here, but in general, he is not as out there. To Rich's point, he doesn't do as many commercials, and yet. You look at Nikola Jokic, the story that he is, the life that he is. He does not subscribe to NBA star-making culture. He prefers to pass rather than score, even though he's an all-time great scorer. How do you not watch that and not go, like, how did this happen? How does a fat kid from Sombor, Serbia, born at a time in his country is being torn asunder by war in Yugoslavia, how does he become the best player in the world that is dispatched the more compelling Suns and Lakers? Like, I would think as a sports writer, you would be salivating to tell that story.
I think you are. But I go back to what I was saying is that, we have covered that. Like, Rohan got one of the few one-on-one interviews with Jokic and went through all that with him. So for me, when I put kind of my feature writer cap on, for us, it's already been done. Like, there are certainly different angles that you can take down the line, and I've done that with multiple subjects over the course of my writing career. But, when I see my colleague write a large takeout piece on Nikola Jokic, I kind of move on and go on to the next thing. I mean, it's not really for me either, guys, Jokic not putting himself out there or Jokic not being willing to do as many one-on-one interviews as I'm sure Nuggets PR and everybody across the league would like him to do. Quite frankly, I kind of like it when guys don't want to talk to me if I'm doing a profile piece on them. Like, I was looking this up. The guy that I've written the most magazine stories on over the last 8 or 9 years has been Kawhi Leonard. In that time, I have probably spent a grand total of 90 seconds interviewing Kawhi Leonard. He has blown me off countless times in San Antonio and Toronto, giving me very little time to do the story. I think it's fun to do stories about guys by writing around them, by interviewing teammates, by interviewing friends, family members. I think that makes for a better story and a more objective story. The reason that I don't lean into Jokic is because for me, for our place, like it has been done, at least on a profile type level.
Chris, I do appreciate you coming on, and I want to keep it in a respectful tone because I'm not like. So I will tell you, I'm a Denver native, and some of what you're hearing, some of the blowback you get from this town right now.
The hatred from the entire state of Colorado.
Well, we just kind of felt this for a while, right? I mean, and look, it goes back to the 80s as far as it goes. I guess what frustrated me in your answer right there that you just gave me was the Jokic story has been told when I would say, with all due respect, hearing about LeBron picking 5 new teammates it's why I turn things off. I've heard that 5,000 times. Kevin Durant going to a new team and getting hurt. I've heard that 5,000 times, and that's where some of our emotions get risen when we hear stuff like that.
I get it. It's frustrating, and like when I was talking about doing the Mitchell story and the Shea Gilgeous-Alexander story, some of that feeds my soul. Doing stories like this that I can tell that I know are not going to be widely read on the internet, but do make for good magazine pieces. You mentioned you don't want to hear more about LeBron. The reality is people do.
Right.
Like that's just the reality of the situation. People want to hear about LeBron's decision making. People want to hear when LeBron hints at retirement, 5,000 different ways of looking at it. If that wasn't the case, it wouldn't be topic one on every ESPN show every day. So for as many people, and I understand where you're coming from, like yourself, that don't like the saturation of LeBron coverage, there's probably exponentially more that do. I mean, that's just the reality of the media business we're in today.
What's wild about it, though, Chris, and again, we're talking to Chris Mannix, SI.com. What's wild about it is, and somebody, Awful Announcing wrote this story, and a Nuggets fan had tweeted this out. Game 4 ends. Nuggets have swept. Jamal and AG get the stop on LeBron James at the end of that game. And we got roughly 4 seconds of Nuggets celebration, followed by 90 seconds of LeBron slow walking all the way down the tunnel. And what's kind of crazy to me...
And thousands of cut-ins of Dave McMenamin having to talk about whatever they talked about from the locker room to the bus.
And what's fascinating to me about that is you mentioned the Warriors as a team that's being more compelling, and yet in 2015 they were not compelling. Like that, they were just sort of starting their climb right now. Like now they're a team that get covered every single day breathlessly, but that's not what they were back then. And all I could think as I sort of watched all of that is man, the Nuggets they're providing everybody this fresh, new, exciting NBA story that people should be wrapping their arms around. Hell, the 2-time league MVPs, giant Serbian brothers, are picking up the team's head coach and tossing him around in celebration like he's a small child. Who sees that and doesn't think man, I want to know more about these guys? It's all right there for you guys. This is on a silver platter.
But look, again, I get exactly what you're saying. I can understand where you're coming from. But let's fast forward this. Let's say the Nuggets beat the Heat or the Celtics in 4 games. And let's say that night LeBron announces his retirement. We're all covering LeBron. That's just the way it is. Unfortunately, that's the way it is in this business. When the greatest player, arguably, in NBA history says he is walking away after 20 seasons, 90% of the basketball coverage is going to be connected to that. It's not to say that the Nuggets wouldn't be an incredible story. First championship, Jokic proving all the skeptics wrong. There are a million different stories you can write about that moment and about that experience, but it's just where we are, that if LeBron does something significant, everyone is going to stop and cover it.
All right, so this will be my final question. Again, thank you for coming on. I'm sure none of us wants to feel jumped when we show up, so I appreciate it.
Hey, for the record, I have you can ask your producer. I think it took 5 seconds for me to respond.
You did. We appreciate it. Hey, Chris, trust me. We've tried to...
believe. Yeah, listen, I firmly believe that if you write something or say something, you have to be accountable for all that stuff. So one of my problems I had was I saw my man Dempsey on your shows earlier just taking shots at me, calling me lazy.
Well,
which I think is wild, but go have at it.
I'll tell you what,
his phone lines are open between 10 and noon every day.
We could get you guys on together if you'd like. This is my final question.
Him. I said, hey man, happy to come on anytime. Always am.
Well, you know what? Maybe people should tune in tomorrow morning. I guess we'll see what Demp says. Just real quick, if the Nuggets win this championship, and I thought Nate brought up Obviously, Golden State. Another team that was always called terribly boring, as you know very well, is the San Antonio Spurs. And what a coincidence. Tim Duncan is the guy that Nikola Jokic says he most likes to be like, staying in a market and just being kind of quiet and to himself. But if the Nuggets win the championship, will some of this change? Or is it just we are about the drama from this point forward?
No, I think it changes because, in part, at least my thinking would be, is this the start of a dynasty, or at least a mini dynasty? Because all the pieces are in place for Denver to be in this position every single year. I mean, Jokic is under contract, seems ecstatic in Denver. Jamal Murray, Porter Jr. under contract. Their front office is brilliant. Like, beginning with Tim Conley and then going down to Calvin Booth now, Tommy Belchetis, I think is an excellent assistant GM who is going to get a head GM job at some point really soon. They have all the pieces in place to be a win 2 championships in 5 years, 3 championships in 5 years type of story. I think that's where the narrative is going to go if they can beat Boston or Miami in the finals. It'll be about what this team is and what it potentially can be. As we're kind of phasing out of this Golden State Warriors era, is Denver now that next super team? Are they the team that becomes the elephant in the room that teams trying to compete with every single year?
Yet they're a slowly constructed and fiscally responsible super team, so I guess it's not as compelling.
How it goes, guys, it's like, I say this all the time. If you draft well, you win.
That's right.
Everyone's focused on trades. Everyone's focused on free agency. Draft well, you win. I mean, you know Jokic's story on the draft. I mean, I go back to the Porter Jr. draft and sitting there and thinking, like, why isn't every GM like Tim Conley? Why isn't every GM saying, well, the 14th pick in the draft is kind of a crapshoot anyway. Why don't I take a chance on the guy with a bad back, but with top 3 talents? I'm not going to take Jerome Robinson, as the Clippers did, a pick before. I mean, if you draft well, you're going to succeed, and Denver is living proof of that.
Chris, in the meantime, Michael Malone will be playing your clip on repeat in his locker room and having a lot of fun with it.
And I just talked to Michael Malone I'm working on a Denver-centric story that's probably not going to come out during the finals because it's tied to a specific event. But I was just talking to Michael Malone. I know him well. I'm sure he's going to make me eat this when I'm out in Denver next week.
That's how he gets down. Chris, man, hey, we appreciate it. Thanks for coming on the show, and enjoy the Denver Nuggets in the NBA Finals.
Anytime, guys.